Hello and welcome to the Palestine Matters podcast series. We're recording this series at the Beyond Borders International Festival at Traquair House in Scotland. Palestine Matters is a joint project of Beyond Borders Scotland and the Britain Palestine Project. Please enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to the sixth episode in this series of podcasts that we're recording from the Beyond Borders Festival, a series jointly between the Britain Palestine Project and Beyond Borders. And in our discussion so far, we've touched on a number of times the reality of contemporary international affairs and politics, the role of Trump and his Realpolitik deal-making compared to the role of diplomacy with the United Nations General Assembly, with the weakness currently in many of the international systems and the crisis in international law. So in this episode, I'm very pleased to be joined by two very distinguished former ambassadors who've spent a lifetime working in diplomacy. And what I'd like to do for the next 20 minutes or so is explore this tension between what we know is the Realpolitik deal-making age in which we live and the traditional forms of diplomacy, which you've both been involved in for a very long time. So I suppose my first question is to you, Francis. As a former ambassador, you look at the world today. Does diplomacy still have a role? Can it still make a difference?
Okay, I need to start with when I was a student of international relations, I had an uncle who was a diplomat, and I took great pleasure in suggesting to him, I'm talking about 40 years ago, that the age of diplomacy was dead, that we didn't need diplomats anymore because it was clear that leaders were just going to speak to each other because they had the means, when I'm talking about before internet even, but even then, 40 years ago, it looked like diplomacy was dead. Clearly, I then spent 25 plus years of my own being a diplomat, arguing that no, actually diplomacy is not dead, because what you need is the nuances, the relations, all of that. And I actually think that what we're seeing now with, you mentioned Trump and his so-called deal making, he is failing to make deals. He's failing to make deals because the background work is not being done, because you actually need the people who know the people. I'm sorry, at the end of the day, we are still going to need that people-to-people contact. Maybe it will be different. Yes, it will be different. Clearly, it will be different. And I accept what you're saying, that some of the institutional makeup is being challenged. That is also not new in the world. Right. But yes, I think I'm not undermining the idea that it's a difficult moment. But I think we still need people who can pick up the phone to the leader, because they know them, because they've been the ambassador in the place and they've had a cup of tea with them or whatever, and they can say, look, I need to come and see you now because I've got something urgent. You can't do that if you've not spent a year or more slowly building up those contacts.
So let's come on in a minute to the question of how it's going to be different, because I think that's absolutely fascinating. But Afif, do you share this faith, this residual faith?
Yes, but let me tell you now, as a retired diplomat, I cannot conceal the feeling that I feel ashamed about the failure of diplomacy, because what do wars mean? And today we are living a proliferation of wars. It's the failure of diplomacy. And I remember in 1992, while we were celebrating or commemorating the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, which is a UN decision, 92. In my introductory speech, I said, what can we wish the Palestinian people on the International Day of Solidarity? And my answer to the audience was to say, I wish the Palestinians that they no more need an International Day of Solidarity, because as long as they need it still, it means that their problem is totally unresolved. Right. So we live with a problem that has been festering for over 75 years, yet still unresolved. Yet I'm an optimist, and in the Palestinian national movement, to which I proudly belong, I played a very important role in the period in the 80s of transition, where we moved beyond double negation towards mutual recognition, when we moved away from the dialogue by arms into adopting the arms of dialogue. So I am a believer in the necessity of dialogue. Now, I'm a Palestinian, and I believe Israelis and Palestinians live in an unavoidable coexistence situation. Whether we like it or not, we are in an unavoidable coexistence. Up to now, it has been harsh. It was one-sided. We paid a historical price. As I said in a lecture I gave recently, I said we are the Jews of the Israelis. We never wanted them to become the Palestinians of the Palestinians. We have become unreasonably reasonable. We are no more demanding absolute justice. We are only asking for possible justice and yet not obtaining it. And I personally believe that today what is acceptable to the Israelis democratically is not acceptable to us Palestinians, and vice versa. And I believe that there is a need for a sort of elegantly imposed solution by the international community. There is one dissenting player and a dominant player, the US administration, which is not joining the international consensus. And I believe the battle for Washington is decisive. Our survival depends on whether we win or lose the battle for Washington. And I'm not resigned to the idea to say that the Trump 3.5 remaining years are not going to be effort. I believe we should wage a battle of persuasion, conviction.
So that's where the diplomacy comes in then. So you still feel in that waging that battle.
Yes.
Diplomacy still matters.
I think that there is a political and an intellectual battle that we have to wage, and it's winnable. What is the battle about? I believe we have to talk to Trump, but also his Republican base. That America is a fascinating society. It's a nation of nations, where every possible country, continent, and culture is represented. And in our today international system, where America is a dominant player, I won't enter into the debate, unipolar system, monopolar system, multipolarity, or whatever. America is still a dominant player. Non-alignment today is not the choice of third world countries. Non-alignment should be what is the policy of the Americans in the Middle East, for example, because if America aligns itself on one belligerent actor, the way it does constantly, it alienates not only all the other regional players, but it offends and alienates part of its own domestic, social, national fabric. It hasn't been easy for 7 decades to be a Palestinian American, and there are 500,000 of those. It hasn't been easy to be an Arab American. There are 5 million of those. And it hasn't been easy to be a Muslim American. There are 10 million of those. Why? Because your country of adoption was not sensitive to the tragedies in your country of origin. So I suggest that the Americans should be non-aligned, even-handed, neutral in regional conflicts. And I personally remember in 2014-15, when Donald Trump started his first campaigning for the primaries of the Republican Party, he was speaking of a neutral America in the Middle East, and he was winning primaries, which means that within the Republican Party and the Republican electoral base, there are some who are not happy to see that the American foreign policy in the Middle East is a subcontract in the Israeli strategy. They believe America first, and it should be the dog wagging the tail and not the tail wagging the dog, the way we see constantly on a daily basis. So I believe the battle is winnable. And I always used to say, there isn't one America, there are 2 Americas. And they don't correspond to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It crosses the ideological divide. There is one America, yes, the descendants of the early European settlers that resulted in almost the total extermination of the indigenous Indian population. The America that institutionalized slavery. The America that expanded shamelessly at the detriment of Mexico, swallowing Texas, New Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And this is probably which indicates why there are sympathies and affinities with the Israeli experience, this settler colonial experience, etc., etc. But there is luckily another America, the America of the founding fathers that defied the colonial power of Great Britain, the America of Abraham Lincoln, that took the painful decision of a civil war which costed a lot human level, to rid itself of slavery, the America of Woodrow Wilson that spoke of self-determination at the Versailles Conference that terminated the First World War, the America of Martin Luther King that had a dream which we shared across continents and across oceans. That's the America we Palestinians, we the Arabs and others, our supporters around the world, we should appeal to. And they are a majority. And I will finish by saying, why do I remain optimistic in spite of the genocide we are witnessing on a daily basis for the last 690 days? I remain optimistic because recently 2 opinion polls are read. In Germany, which for us has always been a very difficult country because of the historic, 60% of German public opinion would like their government to recognize the state of Palestine. And in America, in an opinion poll conducted by Reuters, which is a very prestigious mainstream establishment worldwide, 58% of American public opinion would like the US administration to recognize a Palestinian state. Very encouraging. Okay. And among the Jewish American community, while Israel is moving rightward towards extreme right-wing fascistic policies, the American Jewish community, which is of decisive importance, is moving in the other direction. I pay tribute to those many individuals and institutions that have been demonstrating in Washington and New York saying, not in our name.
Right. So let's take that optimism, okay? And Francis, what I'd like you to think, is there an example from your career where diplomacy in a complex, difficult situation like this has made a concrete difference?
I just wanted to say one thing to add to what Afif was saying, if I may, which is that a lot of Arab Americans voted for Trump because he promised peace. Yes. And I think there is a peace, maybe it's for diplomacy, maybe it's for something broader, to agitate in that Republican space and beyond the Republican space, as Afif said. So that is a role for a clever representation of the Palestinians maybe, but also for anyone of us who wants that to see a positive result.
But how do you do that? How would you do that then? For an example from your career of
I think
where that's happened.
When you asked that question, I was thinking of something where a diplomat, as opposed to somebody who's has stood up for something and done it by argument. And I would take an American example, if I may, and not Palestinian, but Yemeni example. Barbara Bodine was the US ambassador to Yemen when I was there for a bit. You will remember that some people tried to blow up USS Cole in Aden. She was under unbelievable pressure for the Americans to totally withdraw, as had happened in Somalia. As soon as something happened where American soldiers were killed, the pressure was to withdraw from that country, to call it a terrorist state, to call it out, to all the rest of it. I would argue that she personally, because she had the diplomatic contacts, and it wasn't obvious. She was a career diplomat, not a paid person, if you like, in the American context.
Not a political appointee, but a career diplomat.
She stood up to FBI pressure, to public pressure, to say, no, actually, what we need to do is we need to carry on working with the Yemeni government. We need to work with these pressures, and we need to have this place as our friends rather than a place that becomes a hotbed of terrorism by excluding them. Whereas, the immediate example was Somalia, where the Americans had run away. So actually, if you have the context, if you have the belief, maybe a bit of luck, because I think the FBI probably didn't play their hand very well, I think you can probably stand up to a bit of pressure. So I think it's possible. What I'm saying is we have to hold out a bit of hope for diplomacy.
But let's build on that, because one of the things that the British Palestine Project discusses is the extent to which Britain should be engaging with Israel at all. There's one argument that says it should be total isolation of Israel. There's one argument that says you've got to carry on working with Israel to try and change internally. Is there any prospect in your mind, Francis, that by Britain continuing that diplomatic, and that's part of Starmer's position, is you keep talking to Israel and trying to influence Israel's policy. Is there anything in that?
That doesn't stop you doing trade sanctions. That doesn't stop you doing the rest. You can carry on talking, but also make it very clear what your stance against the politics of it. I believe that you should carry on talking to all sorts. I mean, when I was in Lebanon, we talked to Hezbollah. I lost that battle. I didn't lose it while I was there, but we lost it in the longer term. But they are still part of government. They still represent an enormous chunk of the Lebanese population. It is massively important to be engaging, not excluding.
And Afif, you talk about this gently imposed solution from above. That implies you have to carry on talking to Israel, engaging with Israel, to get them to come towards that solution.
Yes, I'm not in favor of the interruption of dialogue, but this can go hand in hand with reprimands and sanctions and accountability. Up to now, the Israelis have been held unaccountable for the misbehavior they have conducted their policy with. And for example, if you read the papers, France intending to recognize the state of Palestine, Netanyahu says, we will close the French consulate in Jerusalem. What political and diplomatic arrogance. Those consulates in Jerusalem predate Netanyahu and predate the Israeli state. They are there since some of them late 18th century, some of them 19th century during the Ottoman period. And for example, Australia withdrew a visa they had given to a very extreme right-wing Israeli parliamentarian, vociferously vehement in the most repulsive manner. The response of Israel was to say, we are going to withdraw the visas of the diplomatic Australian representation in Ramallah to the Palestinian Authority. That type of arrogance, they did the same thing with the Spanish. The Prime Minister of Spain, a very courageous person, a personal friend of mine, Pedro Sanchez, president of the International Socialists, which is the social democratic movement worldwide, which groups over 100 political parties, many of which are in power. He says, I will attend the conference in the UN in September, which he did, and we will recognize the Palestinian state. Again, the threat of closing the Spanish embassy in Jerusalem. I'm a Roman Catholic from Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, for example, the status quo going back to Ottoman periods. For example, for the Christmas Bethlehem Mass in the Nativity Church, which I attended several times, there are 4 chairs for the 4 Catholic nations represented in Jerusalem through their consulates since the 19th century. And the 4 Catholic nations are France, Italy, Spain, and Belgium. Netanyahu, all this, he waves away with that, while we religiously maintain this tradition, because we, the Palestinian people, we feel we are the custodians of the different messages that took birth in Palestine, even if we can be atheists. For example, I, for one, I often say I'm a proud sociological Christian. Theologically, I happen to have doubts, but also doubts about my doubts. But I'm a proud sociological Christian. And for example, this tradition of the eve of Christmas, the 4 Catholic nations represented with the Palestinian community and the different convents in Palestine who are populated mainly by foreign priests and nuns, it's part of the beauty and the aesthetics of the country, of the sociology, the culture, the anthropology of the country. Netanyahu waves it away. And I don't know what you both feel about the following. I consider that there is a concept in international relations that has been underused and underexploited. It's a concept fabricated by Thomas Schelling, a professor prominent in Harvard. And the concept is compellence. People are more familiar with the word deterrence. Deterrence is a legitimate policy for countries. And what does it imply? It means deterrence, to deter and dissuade a neighbor of undertaking policies that are detrimental to my interests. Compellence, au contraire, is the opposite. Compellence is when an actor in a regional system tries to compel and coerce its environment into doing what suits me best. And this is what Netanyahu is doing today. Not only in Palestine, where he's engineering genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza, because he sees the indigenous population as undesirables and a demographic threat, but this is what he's doing in your Lebanon, where you were posted there and still remembered very proudly, by the way, and bravo for a wonderful career you have had in Arab countries and Arab societies. He is doing it towards Syria, and he would like to do it even beyond. Compellence. And compellence is a repulsive policy that has to be resisted not only by the regional actors, but all the others. And let me tell you something, Brian. There is no more a regional conflict, and especially not a regional conflict in the Middle East. They always overspill. We still remember 1973. You were probably too young, but I have been...
No, I remember.
I was 23 in 73. The overspill capability of our regional wars is obvious. Military, economic, and demographic. So the international community has to have a say. And I personally believe in international relations, we need a code of conduct. This is why international law is important. And I'm a believer of international law and of UN institutions. And I remember having read when I was a student the memoirs of Dean Acheson, a very distinguished American Secretary of State. Like they make them no more now, the Blinkens and the Rubios, etc. What is that? Lightweight. Blinken, for example, I can't remember one sentence which is quotable after he left the state. I don't remember one sentence. But Dean Acheson, his memoirs, by the way, are titled Present at the Creation. The creation of what? Mainly the UN institution. And I remember having read a sentence there where he says, the UN Charter is a condensed version of American philosophy and ideology. I agree with him, by the way, because I am a fan of the Founding Fathers. I am a fan of the Proclamation of Independence. I am a fan of the pursuit of happiness. For me, happiness is a concept I frequently use. Each time I meet somebody I like, I say, I wish you success and happiness. Happiness. So all the campaigns by the pro-Israeli Inquisition in America for the last 40 years against the UN, preaching that America should withdraw its funding and its presence in the UN institutions. The UN has been an American creation, if you read Dean Acheson, Present at the Creation.
But
and the international law that it has produced, the charter that we consider as the rules of the game in international relations, Dean Acheson tells us it's a condensed version of American philosophy at its best and American ideology.
And they've just announced, the US, in a leaked memo that's gone round to the embassies in preparation for the UN General Assembly, they're saying that the UN needs to return to its founding principles. And it's defining, and Trump administration is defining those founding principles as sovereignty. There should be nothing that should interfere in the sovereignty of individual nations, and I think liberty and something else.
My friend, the UN Charter is a book for the code of conduct. And whoever does not respect a certain acceptable and recommendable code of conduct it must have its sovereignty contained. And containment is another concept American establishment is not unfamiliar with.
But given America, Francis, given their take on the UN, and the way they want to change the UN, reform the UN. What prospect is there for a kind of reform of multilateralism, of that kind of engagement? We're seeing a lot of pressure from the Global South, from the Hague Group of Nations. They seem to be leading on Israel-Palestine. In this context, is it possible for the UN to regain a significant role in what will be some sort of peace process emerging after the UNGA in September?
So you talk about the General Assembly, which is arguably one of the more democratic parts of the United Nations, and therefore has its strengths, and we'll carry on talking about multilateralism, and we'll support these movements from the Global South.
I can feel a but coming.
Well, the but is the institution of the Security Council, unfortunately, and that has what's hampered the work of the UN from the beginning. Let's also be honest, that the vetoing by the so-called great powers has thwarted the essential obligations of the United Nations to support and promote peace and security. Ideally, and there's been so much talk about it, ideally you would get to a place where you reform the Security Councils. There's lots of options out there which are perfectly workable the naysayers are actually on that one, probably France and the UK, because they are the ones that will lose their special place in the world. But it's time to move on from a post-colonial construct and move to somewhere else. I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately, that we'll get there, but maybe the pressure from the General Assembly could eventually get there. I've not worked in the General Assembly, I don't know. Afif might be able to give us a better
What do you think?
I'm in a way sad that we live in an era of mediocrity, and we no more have great leaders, for example, in the global south, like the days when we had Nehru, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Nkrumah. Yes, we have Lula now in Brazil, but he's plunged into problems that are often orchestrated and engineered from elsewhere. But we don't have the caliber of leadership in the global south. In the global north, I am a fan of General de Gaulle, by the way. And I'm happy that Macron is becoming more assertive, and I hope he will continue with steadily on the path he has announced that he will be following. What we need today is that many important Western countries, and I include it with those besides France, Britain, but I include also Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, recognizing the state of Palestine. Why? Because it will be a signal to the Israelis and to the Americans that this is the destination and the finality of any future coming diplomatic endeavor. As I said in a lecture recently, I'm not in favor of a step-by-step approach towards nowhere. We have tried it frequently and failed. We need to have agreed upon the finality and the destination of the endeavor at the beginning and move towards that finality. And the world would be signaling what is desirable, possible, and doable. But what we need is statesmanship, but also perseverance and determination, because as you can expect, the pro-Israeli Inquisition will be unleashed. And they are masters in character assassination, pressuring. And the pro-Israeli Inquisition has grew accustomed in using one muscle too many and going one pressure too far. And unfortunately, political establishments have caved in. I will borrow a concept from Netanyahu in his speech on Capitol Hill when he said, speaking of the student movement, of which I am very proud in America, he called them the useful idiots of Iran. On the contrary, those student movements on campuses, I salute them and I greet them and I bow in respect, chapeau, because, you know, in political science, the end of ideology was announced decades ago, the end of history was announced. I'm happy with those students demonstrating and paying a price for it. They are showing that we don't witness today the end of idealism. And I'm a great fan of idealism. And unfortunately, on Capitol Hill, there are those whom I call Netanyahu's useful idiots, who in the 3-4 times that they have received him, sometimes even contrary to the desiderata of the president of the American government. I remember when he imposed himself contrary to the wishes of Obama, etc., to lobby against the policy towards Iran, etc. And each time he would repeat a deplorable platitude, congressmen felt compelled to stand up for fear of being seen by the camera as insufficiently enthusiastic. Well, today that lobby is being fractured, and many Democrats are signing petitions to the president asking for the interruption of military supplies to Israel, linking aid to advice, because up to now Israel takes all the aid and leaves the advice aside. Well, if the Americans were to tell them you can have the aid only if you take the advice, I believe that my hope as a diplomat has been, Brian, to wait for what I call the Eisenhower moment. You know, Eisenhower was a great military leader, but he was twice an American president on behalf of the Republican Party. In '56, during an election year, and usually the wisdom is to be prudent in an election year. During an election year, Israel takes part in an aggression and a war of aggression against Egypt with Great Britain and France, with a phone call Netanyahu, Eisenhower to Ben Gurion, he has them within 24 hours withdraw out of the Sinai. And believe me,
and to Eden as well, and to Eden.
And Anthony, but I'm now.
You phoned Eden as well.
Today we are occupied by Netanyahu. British presence in Palestine ended in a tragic way in 1948. So I am waiting for the Eisenhower moment when an American president will have the courage, political courage. And I always say Palestine-Israel is a test between courage and cowardice. Make a phone call to Netanyahu, who compared to Ben Gurion looks like a lamb. The other one was a roaring lion. In 24 hours, he withdraws out of the Sinai. Mm-hmm. So this is what I'm hoping for, the Eisenhower moment.
I would also add, Israel is not isolated from the world. It is dependent on the international economy as much, if not more, than many other countries. And certainly there's some signs that some of that intellectual fast class that they've been talking about, dealing with lots of modern technology, has been fleeing Israel at the moment. So I think I'm interested in the juxtaposition with your point about Americans going back to sovereignty. It's quite ironic when you think about the American-based international corporations that are ignoring sovereignty around the world, who are probably some of the real powers in the world at the moment. So feels like a lot that America could play with, actually. So an Eisenhower moment, but actually a bit of economic muscle as well.
Right. So, thank you very much. Despite genocide, despite famine, the age of diplomacy is not dead. We are declaring it still alive, and we're hoping that an Eisenhower moment will come to help resolve this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.